I needed a place to work. Not just any place. Somewhere quiet, away from the noise of the city, away from the constant distraction of traffic, sirens, neighbors yelling, phones buzzing, emails flooding in. I wanted stillness. I wanted to sit down with my unfinished novel and finally get it done. That's how I ended up in a small rental cabin deep in the Maine woods in the dead of winter. The listing had been simple. Off-grid cabin, no internet, with stove, generator, 2 miles off the main road. The photos showed a small wooden structure, half buried in snow, surrounded by trees so tall and thick they looked like a wall. It was perfect. Remote, yes, but I thought that was exactly what I needed. I had packed up groceries, a few boxes of firewood, extra fuel, notebooks, and my laptop. The drive up had been long, the roads narrowing until I was just creeping along a 1-lane snowpacked trail. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting. The trees crowded in on all sides, tall pines and leafless birches, their branches heavy with snow. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by woods. The nearest neighbor, I was told, was at least a mile away. Inside, the place was small but cozy. There was a wood stove in the corner, a simple desk by the front window, a small bed in the corner, and a kitchen setup with an old gas stove and a sink. I set up my laptop on the desk, lit the lamps, and got the stove roaring. Outside, the wind started to pick up, whispering through the trees, making them creak and groan. But inside, I was warm and content. The first night passed without anything unusual. I worked late, the light of the laptop screen reflecting in the window, beyond which was only blackness. I didn't think much about it. The woods were peaceful, the silence almost complete except for the occasional gust of wind or the distant creak of snow shifting in the trees. The next day, I woke up early, made coffee on the stove, and got back to work. I barely noticed the daylight coming and going. It wasn't until the sun was dipping below the trees again that I stretched and noticed the snow had started falling outside, thick flakes drifting down, softening the outlines of the trees and covering the ground in a fresh layer of white. That night, while I was working at the desk, I heard a faint sound, a soft, slow scraping, just on the other side of the window next to me. I froze, listening. It came again, faint, dragging, like something brushing or scraping against the glass. I turned my head quickly, looking out, but all I saw was the dark shape of the trees, the white snow drifting down. I stood up, pressed my face close to the window, cupping my hands to block the reflection of the lamp. Nothing, just trees, snow, and the faint outline of the clearing. I told myself it was probably a branch moving in the wind. After all, the trees were close to the cabin. I went back to work, the sound gone. The next morning, I went outside with an armload of firewood. As I walked past the window, I noticed something. Long, thin scrape marks on the outside of the glass. 3 or 4 parallel lines running down the pane from the top to the bottom. I set the wood down and leaned in closer. They weren't deep, but they were clear. I looked up, sure enough, there was a low-hanging branch nearby. I shrugged. Wind must have pushed it against the window. That night, the wind was stronger. It rattled the windows and moaned through the trees. I built up the fire again, sat at the desk, and tried to focus on writing. But around 9 or 10, I heard it again, the scraping. This time, it wasn't just at the window next to me. It moved. I heard the sound shift from the window by the desk to the front window. Then, a minute later, the window over by the kitchen. Soft, dragging like fingernails across glass. I sat frozen, listening, my heart pounding hard in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was the trees, swaying in the wind, their branches brushing against the cabin. But the trees weren't close on every side. I'd walked around the cabin when I first arrived. Some sides were open, nothing near enough to reach the glass. The scraping stopped. I waited, sitting still, hardly breathing. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably just a few minutes, I got up and walked to the door. I made sure the lock was latched, checked the windows, made sure they were closed tight. Then I added more wood to the stove, turned off the lamps, and crawled into bed. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every little crack or pop in the wood made me jolt awake. I kept thinking about those scrape marks, the soft, dragging sound circling the house. By morning, the snow had stopped. A fresh blanket of white covered the clearing, the sky bright and blue. I made coffee and forced myself to step outside, telling myself I needed some air. The first thing I noticed were the footprints. They were faint but clear, barefoot tracks circling the cabin. Human footprints. No shoes, no boots, just the shape of bare feet, toes and all, pressed into the snow, moving slowly around the cabin. Not once, but multiple times. I crouched down and stared at them, my breath clouding in the cold air. They started near the edge of the woods, came up to the window by the desk, circled the house, stopped at the kitchen window and circled again. They were fresh, maybe from last night, maybe from early this morning. I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure. They weren't mine. I stood there, heart pounding, scanning the tree line. Everything was still, silent, calm, but my skin crawled. Who would be out here, barefoot in the snow, in the middle of nowhere? Who would be walking slowly around the cabin, stopping at each window, scraping at the glass? I went back inside, locked the door, checked every window again. I sat down at the desk and tried to work, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the window, kept listening for any sound. The trees stood silent, heavy with snow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. By mid-afternoon, I made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my laptop, my notebooks, stuffed my clothes back into the bag. I loaded up the firewood and leftover food. The sun was already dipping low by the time I had the car packed. As I stood by the cabin one last time, I looked around the clearing. Nothing, just trees, the cabin, and the wide white stretch of snow. But the footprints were still there, circling the cabin like a slow, deliberate path. I got in the car, turned the engine over, and eased down the snow-packed trail. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see a figure step out from behind a tree. But the road stayed empty. It took me over an hour to get back to the main road. When I finally hit pavement again, I pulled over and sat there, shaking. The daylight was almost gone, the sky going dark. I pulled out my phone, checked for service. Nothing. I drove another 10 miles before I got a signal and called a friend just to hear a familiar voice, even if I didn't tell him why. That night, I checked into a motel on the edge of town. The place was nothing fancy. Old carpets, flickering lights, thin walls, but it felt safe. I double-locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, and sat on the bed, listening to the low hum of the heater. I kept thinking about those scrape marks, those barefoot prints. Who had been out there? What had they wanted? I didn't go back to the cabin. I messaged the rental owner and told him I'd left early, left the key under the mat. He didn't ask why, and I didn't offer an explanation. For days afterward, I kept wondering if I should have called someone. The police, maybe, but what would I tell them? That I heard a noise, saw some marks and ran? There was no real proof of anything. No break-in, no harm done. But even now, months later, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that slow, careful scraping, circling the cabin, moving from window to window, just outside the glass. I don't know who or what was out there. I just know I'm not going back. We just wanted a break. That's all. Just a quiet weekend away, just the two of us. No work, no calls, no emails, no appointments. We'd both been working hard, long hours, barely seeing each other except when we collapsed into bed at night. So when we found the listing for the cabin, it felt like exactly what we needed. The listing said remote cabin, perfect for couples, surrounded by nature, no neighbors for miles. The photos showed a small, rustic wooden cabin with a porch, a wood stove, and big windows looking out over the forest. It looked peaceful, private. We booked it right away. We drove up on a Friday afternoon. The road wound through dense trees, narrowing the deeper we went. There were no other cars, no signs of houses, just trees and the occasional patch of snow clinging to the shadows. When we pulled up, the cabin sat at the end of a long dirt drive, small and simple, just like the pictures. Inside, the place was cozy. There was a small living area with a couch and a bookshelf, a tiny kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. It smelled faintly of wood and old pine needles, but it was clean. There were no TVs, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. Exactly what we wanted. We unpacked, made some tea, and sat on the couch, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. That first night, we cooked a simple dinner, lit some candles, and sat by the fire. The only sounds were the crackle of the wood and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Outside, the woods were completely dark. No streetlights, no distant cars, no glow on the horizon. Just blackness. I remember feeling happy, relaxed even. It had been a long time since I felt that way. I stretched out on the couch, glancing around the room. That's when I noticed it. A tiny blinking red light on the bookshelf. It was faint, easy to miss if you weren't looking right at it. But there it was, blinking slowly between two old books. I got up and walked over. Between the books, I saw a small black object, no bigger than a matchbox. I pulled the books aside and realized it was a camera. A tiny camera with the lens pointed straight out into the room. My stomach dropped. I stared at it for a long time, my mind trying to catch up. It was small, probably the kind you could buy online, the kind used for home security or baby monitors. But this one wasn't on display. It was hidden. I called over my partner, and together we searched the room. The more we looked, the more we noticed things that didn't feel right. In the corner of the ceiling, tucked into the smoke detector, there was another tiny camera. We pulled it down. Sure enough, there was a small hole in the casing where the lens peeked through. Neither of us spoke much. We didn't need to. We both felt the same cold, sinking feeling. We grabbed our bags, turned off the lights, locked the door, and got in the car. We drove in silence, the trees rushing past the headlights. It was late, past midnight, but we didn't care. We just wanted to get out of there. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. Every time I thought about those cameras, I felt sick. When we finally got to the nearest town, we found a gas station with lights still on. We pulled over and called the police. We told them everything, the cameras, the hidden smoke detector, the blinking light on the bookshelf. They took down the details and said they'd send someone to check it out. We checked into a cheap motel for the night, exhausted but unable to sleep. We lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how long those cameras had been there, how many people had stayed in that cabin without knowing. The next day, we drove to the local police station to follow up. They told us they'd gone out to the cabin, found multiple hidden cameras, not just the two we saw, but others too. There were cameras in the bedroom, the bathroom, even outside pointing at the windows. They arrested the cabin owner, and then they told us the part that made my stomach turn all over again. They had found videos online. Videos taken from those cameras, posted without anyone's knowledge. I felt sick, cold all over. The idea that strangers had been watching us, watching other couples, watching people in what should have been private moments. It was worse than anything I could have imagined. We gave the police our statements, did everything we could to help. They said they'd be in touch, but even after we left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked at a corner of a room, a smoke detector, a bookshelf, I felt that crawling sensation under my skin. In the weeks that followed, we kept hearing updates. The owner had been running the cameras for months, maybe longer. Dozens of guests had been recorded. Some of the footage had been sold, some posted on shady sites. The police were working on taking it all down, but they admitted it would be hard to erase everything once it was out there. I started checking every room we stayed in after that. Every hotel, every rental, even friends' guest rooms. I looked for blinking lights, strange holes in smoke detectors, hidden lenses in clocks or shelves. I knew it wasn't rational, but I couldn't help it. We never went back to that cabin, obviously. We got our money refunded, but that didn't really matter. The damage was done. Even now, when I think back on that weekend, I remember the slow blinking of that red light, the cold rush of realizing we were being watched. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away, just the two of us. But it turned into something I can't forget, no matter how much time passes. We just wanted a break, but we came back with something else, the awful, sinking knowledge that privacy is never guaranteed, that even in the middle of nowhere, in a place that feels safe, you can never be sure who's watching. I remember that weekend so clearly now, even though at the time it all seemed harmless, even fun. There were 5 of us, me, Mark, Jenna, Luke, and Sarah, and we'd been planning the trip for weeks. A long weekend at a cabin near a big hunting lodge deep in the woods. Mark had found it online, some rental listing. He'd gotten a good deal because it was late in the season, right before the heavy snows. We all arrived on a Thursday afternoon, our cars bumping along the rough gravel road, tires crunching over dead leaves and small stones. The air smelled sharp and cold, like with smoke and wet earth. The cabin was smaller than the photos had made it look, but it was cozy, with thick wooden beams, a fireplace, and a small kitchen. It sat a short walk away from the larger hunting lodge, which looked older and sturdier, like it had seen a lot more winters. We unpacked and settled in. Mark and Luke carried in the firewood. Jenna and Sarah made sandwiches. I wandered outside, stretching my legs, walking toward the lodge. That's when I first saw the man. He was standing on the porch of the hunting lodge, a tall, older guy with gray hair under a dark cap. He wore a heavy coat and hunting boots, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He raised a hand and waved when he saw me. I waved back, a little awkward, but he just gave me a small smile and went back inside. That night, we drank beer by the fire, played cards, laughed too loudly. Everything felt normal, felt safe. The next day, we split up. Some of us hiked a trail near the lake. Others stayed behind to nap or read. It was cold but not unbearable. The trees were tall and thin, their bare branches rattling in the breeze. Now and then, we'd hear a shot echo faintly through the woods, and we'd guess it was the old man hunting. But we didn't see him, not once that whole second day. That night, we sat outside on the porch for a while, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No other guests had come to the hunting lodge that weekend, and the forest around us seemed to press in closer after dark. I remember looking over at the lodge and noticing that no lights were on. I figured the old guy had gone to bed early. The third morning, I woke up early, before the others. I made coffee and stepped outside. The sun was barely up, mist curling along the ground. As I walked toward the woodshed to grab more firewood, I stopped. Something smelled bad. It was faint at first, like a sharp, sour stink drifting on the wind. I wrinkled my nose, trying to figure out what it was. Maybe an animal had died nearby, a deer or raccoon or something. Mark came out a little while later and I told him about the smell. He shrugged, but when we walked over to the side of the cabin near the woodshed, he paused. We both stood there, staring at the ground. There was a pair of boots, heavy, muddy hunting boots, sitting neatly beside the shed. Next to them, leaning against the woodpile, was a hunting rifle. I felt a weird chill crawl up my back. Mark bent down, looking closer. The boots looked like they'd been taken off carefully, the laces loosened. But next to them, the dirt was all scuffed up. And then we saw it. Faint marks in the dead leaves and soil, long, uneven drag marks, leading away from the shed and into the trees. By then, the others had come out to see what we were looking at. We all stood there, quiet now, the cold morning air thick with the sour smell. Maybe he fell, Sarah said quietly, but none of us really believed it. We followed the drag marks just a few yards into the trees before stopping. The forest was dense, the ground uneven. We couldn't see very far, and honestly, none of us wanted to go deeper. We went back to the cabin, packed up, and left early. Later, when we got to town, we stopped at the small local police station. We told them what we'd found, showed them photos we'd taken on our phones. The officer at the desk listened carefully, nodded, and then told us something that stayed with me long after. He said the area had had trouble before. Poachers, illegal hunters, people crossing onto private land. Sometimes people got into arguments out there in the woods. Sometimes people disappeared. They'd send someone to check the lodge, he said, but he didn't sound surprised or alarmed. It was like this kind of thing happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. We never found out what happened to the old man. We never saw his face again, never learned his name. Even now, when I think back on that weekend, I feel a deep, uneasy twist in my stomach. I remember the rifle propped so neatly against the shed. I remember the boots, lined up like someone had taken their time. I remember the drag marks, pulling away into the trees, where the shadows were thick and the light barely reached. And I remember how we all just left, because we were scared, because we didn't know what else to do, because in the end, the woods keep their own secrets. I went up to the cabin because I wanted some time alone. My family had owned it for years, a small wooden place by a lake in the northern woods. My parents didn't use it much anymore, and my brother only came up for fishing in the summer. But I liked the quiet, the way the cold air smelled, the way the pine trees swayed outside. It was late fall, almost winter, and most people were gone for the season. I got there in the afternoon. The sky was already pale and thin, the sun low behind the trees. I unpacked my bags, turned up the old furnace, and made some tea. I wandered through the little rooms, the living room with its big window, the small kitchen with the worn linoleum floor, the 2 bedrooms with the sagging mattresses and old quilts. It was peaceful, quiet in the way that makes you notice small sounds, the creak of the floorboards, the hiss of the furnace, the occasional rustle of branches outside. That first evening, I read by the fireplace. The wind picked up after dark, and I could hear it sliding against the windows, making the pine branches scrape and tap the glass. I wasn't scared. I had been coming here since I was a kid. I knew the place. I trusted it. Before bed, I double-checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. I turned off the lights and stood for a moment, staring out the front window. The porch light cast a small circle outside, but beyond that was just blackness, the trees, the lake, the hills in the distance. Nothing moved. I went to bed and fell asleep quickly, curled under the heavy blankets, feeling the heat of the furnace coming through the vent. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I lay still, eyes open, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, knocking, a loud, sharp knock on the front door. I froze. My heart started pounding immediately, filling my chest, my throat, my ears. I listened hard, hoping I'd imagined it. But a few seconds later, it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me. I felt dizzy, disoriented. Who would be at the door at? I looked at the clock, 2:03 a.m. I slipped out of bed, moving slowly and quietly. The floor creaked under my feet. I crept down the short hall toward the front window, careful not to step too hard. My fingers shook as I pushed aside the edge of the curtain and peered out. Nothing. The porch light was still on, casting its pale circle on the small wooden steps and the empty clearing beyond. I couldn't see anyone. I stood there for a long moment, waiting, heart hammering in my chest. Maybe it had been the wind, I thought. Maybe a branch. Maybe the house settling. I started to turn away. Then the knocking came again. Harder this time, more urgent. I jumped, a sharp jolt running through me. It was definitely the door. And whoever it was, they were still there. I stumbled back, breathing hard. My mind raced. Could it be my brother? He was supposed to come up the next morning, but maybe he'd arrived early? Maybe something had happened on the road? My hands fumbled for my phone on the table. I texted him, "Are you here?" A minute passed. Then my phone buzzed. No, still 2 hours away. Why? I stared at the screen, my stomach dropping. The knocking came again, steady, forceful. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I turned off all the lights, one by one, and sat down on the floor behind the couch, out of view from the window. I pulled a blanket around me and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control my breathing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then, another knock. I didn't get up. I didn't look. I just sat there, listening to the wind outside, the creaks of the old house, and the occasional sharp knock at the door. Time dragged. I stared at the pale glow of my phone, watching the minutes tick by. Every now and then, I thought I heard movement outside. A crunch in the snow, a scrape on the porch, but I told myself it was the wind. I thought about calling the police, but I knew there was no cell signal this far out. I thought about running out the back door, but where would I go? The woods were thick, and the road was long and empty, so I stayed still. I waited. The knocking came again, sometimes every few minutes, sometimes with long gaps in between. It went on, the slow, patient tapping of someone who wasn't in any hurry. I wondered what they wanted. I wondered if they knew I was inside. I wondered if they would go away. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is the faint gray light of dawn creeping in through the windows. I blinked, my body stiff and cold, and slowly sat up. The cabin was quiet. I crept to the window, heart still pounding. The porch was empty. The clearing was empty. No sign of anyone. I waited until full daylight before moving. I packed my bags, grabbed my keys, and left as quickly as I could. I didn't even make coffee. I didn't check the porch. I just locked the door behind me and drove. As I pulled away, I looked back once, just to be sure. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone, but I knew what I'd heard. I met my brother at the diner in town, told him what had happened. He looked worried, but we both agreed there was nothing to do. No one to report, no real evidence. Just the memory of hours spent in the dark, waiting for someone who never showed themselves. That was the last time I stayed at the cabin alone. Now, even months later, when I lie awake at night, I think about those slow, steady knocks. I think about the way they kept coming, even when I didn't answer, even when the night dragged on. I think about how whoever it was never tried the handle, never called out, never showed themselves. And I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. Growing up along the California coast, the ocean was my second home. The rhythm of the waves, the salty breeze, and the thrill of catching the perfect swell were integral parts of my life. Over the years, I had my fair share of close calls, wiping out on massive waves, getting caught in rip currents, but nothing ever shook me to my core. One of my buddies, Jake, worked for the Pelagic Shark Research Foundation in California, studying shark behavior around San Francisco, Santa Cruz, and the Farallon Islands. He once told me, "If you ever feel spooked while surfing, get out of the water. Most shark attack victims report feeling that way before an attack. It's probably some leftover survival instinct from our caveman days, something stalking you." I took his advice to heart. There were times when I'd be out on the water, and an unshakable sense of dread would wash over me. No visible threats, no changes in the environment, just an overwhelming feeling that I needed to get out. And I did. Years later, I decided to take a solo camping trip to reconnect with nature. I chose a remote coastal area in Northern California, a place known for its rugged beauty and isolation. The plan was to hike in, set up camp near the cliffs overlooking the ocean, and spend a few days unwinding. The first day was uneventful. I hiked through dense forests, the canopy filtering sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds chirped, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush kept me company. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing near the cliffs, offering a breathtaking view of the Pacific. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and prepared a simple meal. As night fell, the temperature dropped. I lit a fire and sat by it, listening to the waves crashing against the rocks below. The rhythmic sound was soothing, and I felt at peace. The next day, I explored the area, hiking along the cliffs and taking in the scenery. The isolation was invigorating. No cell service, no people, just me and nature. That evening, as I sat by the fire, a sudden unease settled over me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart rate increased. I looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The forest was quiet, the ocean steady. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to being alone in the wilderness. But the sensation persisted, growing stronger. It was the same instinctual fear I'd felt in the water years ago. The sense that something was watching me, stalking me. I decided to retreat into my tent, hoping the enclosed space would provide some comfort. Inside, I lay on my sleeping bag, listening intently. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. Suddenly, I heard a distinct snapping of a twig nearby. My body tensed. I held my breath, straining to hear more. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, approached my campsite. I reached for the flashlight and knife I kept by my side. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing heavy and steady. I remained motionless, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, the breathing ceased, and the footsteps retreated into the forest. I waited, listening for any sign of return, but the night remained silent. At first light, I cautiously emerged from my tent. The campsite appeared undisturbed, but I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt. Large, human-like, but barefoot. They circled my tent and led back into the woods. I packed up immediately, my nerves frayed. The hike back was tense, every sound causing me to jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally reached my car and drove away, relief washed over me. But the experience left a lasting impression. It wasn't a ghost or a mythical creature. It was something real, something primal. A reminder that, even in our modern world, we're still vulnerable to the instincts and dangers of the wild. I'm going to tell you everything exactly how it happened, without leaving anything out. I want to get it all down because even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about it. My friend Mark and I had planned a hiking weekend in Utah for months. We both worked busy jobs back in Denver, and it was hard to line up time off, but finally we booked a 3-day weekend. We rented a small cabin near the base of the mountains, close to a bunch of trails, with the plan to hike during the day and chill out at night. No cell reception, no internet, just some beers, some simple food, and the outdoors. We drove out early Friday morning, arriving at the cabin by midday. It was small and rustic with 2 rooms, a basic kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a narrow porch. The closest neighbor was half a mile away, and the area was surrounded by dense trees and steep ridges. It felt peaceful, almost too quiet after leaving the noise of the city. We unpacked, stretched our legs, and decided to head out for a short afternoon hike. There was a trailhead about a 10-minute walk from the cabin, marked on the map the rental owner left us. We grabbed our day packs, filled our water bottles, and set off. The trail was beautiful. Dry, rocky paths wound up through pine and aspen trees, the late summer sun streaming down through the branches. We hiked uphill steadily for about 30 minutes when we ran into him. The man came down the trail toward us, waving as he approached. He looked to be in his 30s, about our age, dressed in worn hiking clothes and carrying a small backpack. He had a friendly, open face, short brown hair, and a big smile. He said he was staying at a cabin nearby and had been hiking solo. He asked if he could join us for a bit since we were all headed in the same direction. Mark and I didn't see any reason to say no. We were in a good mood, enjoying the day, and it was nice to have someone else to talk to. So we walked together, chatting about the area, the weather, where we were from. The guy, he never told us his name, and thinking back, we never asked, was cheerful, curious, and a little scattered. He asked a lot of questions about the trails, about our cabin, about how long we were staying. After about an hour, we reached a spot where the trail split. There was a rocky outcrop, and the guy said he needed to check something real quick and stepped off the path into the trees. We waited for a few minutes, looking around, drinking some water, but he didn't come back. We called out once or twice, but the trees were dense, and we figured maybe he'd gone off on his own. Maybe he'd decided to loop back on another trail. We shrugged it off. After all, we didn't know him, and it wasn't our responsibility. We hiked for another hour before heading back toward the cabin. By the time we returned, the sun was dipping low, the air cooling fast. We made a simple dinner, had a couple of beers, and sat out on the porch as the sky turned dark. Neither of us mentioned the guy much. It wasn't that strange, we told ourselves. Hikers come and go. Maybe he just wanted some solo time again. But something about it kept tugging at the back of my mind. That night, around midnight, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. The cabin was old, and the walls creaked sometimes. But as I lay there, I realized it wasn't the walls. It was outside. Footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps, crunching the dry ground outside the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The footsteps circled the cabin. I could tell by the shifting sound, moving from one side to the other. I heard them pause at the window by the kitchen, then move to the window near the front door. Then the back window. I held my breath, waiting, listening, frozen. In the other room, I heard Mark shift, then sit up too. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We both heard it. The footsteps circled the cabin for what felt like hours, though it was probably just 20 or 30 minutes. Finally, they stopped. I barely slept the rest of the night. In the morning, we stepped outside carefully, looking around. The ground was dry and hard, but we could make out faint impressions. Footprints circling the cabin, pacing between the windows. That's when we decided to check the trail registry. There was a small wooden board at the trailhead, where hikers signed in with their names, dates, and the trails they planned to hike. We walked over there after breakfast, hoping maybe to find the guy's name, something to tell us who he was. We flipped through the logbook, page after page, but there was no one matching his description. No solo hikers staying nearby, no recent names that fit. We both stood there for a while, not saying anything. Then we packed up, went back to the cabin, and decided to cut the trip short. We drove back to Denver that afternoon, mostly silent on the ride home. Later, we called the local ranger station just to let them know. They listened carefully but didn't seem surprised. They told us calmly that the area sometimes attracted squatters, illegal campers, even occasional drifters. They took down what details we gave, said they'd keep an eye on the trails, and thanked us for calling. Mark and I haven't gone back since. Even now, I think about it. I think about the man on the trail, his easy smile, the way he asked about our cabin. I think about how he walked into the trees and never came back. Not on the trail, anyway. And I wonder if he ever left the woods at all. I want to tell this story the way it really happened. No adding anything, no fancy words, no making it more dramatic than it already was. I'm just gonna lay it all out straight because even now, weeks later, I can still hear those sounds sometimes when I close my eyes. It all started when I rented a small hunting cabin in rural Kentucky for a weekend alone. I'm not from there. I live a few states over, but I had friends who'd hunted in that area, and they told me it was quiet, remote, and good for white-tailed deer. I needed a break. Work had been rough, life had been rough, and I wanted to get out of town, clear my head, spend some time alone. The cabin was old but solid. It sat on a small patch of cleared land, surrounded by woods on all sides, a dirt road leading up to it. Inside, it was basic. One room with a bed, a wood stove, a small table and chair, and some old hunting gear hanging on the walls. No electricity, no running water. I brought my own supplies: lanterns, food, water, and my rifle. I arrived Friday afternoon, unloaded my truck, and settled in. The woods were quiet, the air cool, the sun slipping behind the trees. I took a short walk to check the area, saw some fresh tracks in the mud, and felt pretty good about my chances for the weekend. That night, I made a small fire in the wood stove, cooked some simple food, and sat on the porch with a lantern beside me. It was completely dark outside, the kind of dark you only get far away from towns. The stars were sharp and clear. The only sounds were crickets and the occasional rustle in the trees. Saturday morning, I was up before dawn, heading out into the woods. I hiked deep into the trees, found a good spot, and waited. I saw a few deer moving in the distance but didn't get a shot. Still, it felt good to sit there, breathe the cold morning air, and let my mind settle. By late afternoon, I headed back to the cabin, tired but content. I made myself some food, cleaned my rifle, and sat on the porch again as the light faded. That night, the woods were even quieter. And then, just after midnight, I heard it. It was faint at first, drifting through the trees. A scream, not an animal. I've been hunting long enough to know the difference. It sounded like a woman screaming, crying out for help. I froze, sitting there on the bed, listening hard. "Help me!" The voice was far off, maybe deep in the woods. It echoed strangely, like it was bouncing between the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and stepped to the window, looking out. Darkness, trees, nothing else. Another scream, closer this time. Still the same voice, a woman crying out, desperate. I opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold, The woods silent except for the distant voice. I swept the flashlight beam across the yard, down the tree line. Nothing. The screams came again, but now they were moving. First farther away, then closer, as if someone was circling the cabin. I turned slowly, heart pounding, trying to see where they were coming from. But there were no lights, no footsteps, no crashing through the brush. Just the voice, sliding around the edges of the clearing. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. I backed up, went back inside, locked the door and pulled the curtains. I sat down with the rifle across my lap, flashlight on the table. My heart was beating hard, and I kept telling myself, maybe it's someone lost. Maybe it's someone playing a prank. Maybe it's some weird animal sound I've never heard before. But none of those answers felt right. I waited like that for hours. The screams kept coming, sometimes close, sometimes far. I thought about calling for help, but there was no cell service, no landline. I thought about getting in my truck and driving out, but I couldn't bring myself to open that door again. By the time the sun started to rise, the sounds had stopped. I stepped outside cautiously, blinking in the early light. The woods were still, the air damp and cold. I walked the edge of the clearing, flashlight still in hand, rifle slung over my shoulder. There were no tracks, no signs of anyone. After packing up my gear, I drove slowly down the dirt road to the main road. I stopped at a small gas station where locals gathered in the mornings, drinking coffee and swapping stories. I mentioned what I'd heard, careful not to sound too shaken, just curious. The old man behind the counter gave me a long look, then said, "Never go chasing those sounds. Sometimes they ain't people." He didn't explain further, and I didn't press. I just nodded, thanked him, and got back in my truck. I drove home, thinking about that night, about those screams circling the cabin, about the cold, empty woods. Since then, I haven't been back. I don't know if I ever will. It's not that I'm afraid of the woods or of being alone. I've hunted in plenty of remote places, camped under the stars, walked trails where no one else goes. But something about that night stuck with me, not knowing who or what was out there, and knowing that if I'd stepped off that porch, if I'd followed the sounds into the trees, I might not be here telling this story now. I want to tell this story the way it really happened. No adding anything, no fancy words, no making it more dramatic than it already was. I'm just gonna lay it all out straight because even now, weeks later, I can still hear those sounds sometimes when I close my eyes. It all started when I rented a small hunting cabin in rural Kentucky for a weekend alone. I'm not from there. I live a few states over, but I had friends who'd hunted in that area, and they told me it was quiet, remote, and good for white-tailed deer. I needed a break. Work had been rough, life had been rough, and I wanted to get out of town, clear my head, spend some time alone. The cabin was old but solid. It sat on a small patch of cleared land, surrounded by woods on all sides, a dirt road leading up to it. Inside, it was basic. One room with a bed, a wood stove, a small table and chair, and some old hunting gear hanging on the walls. No electricity, no running water. I brought my own supplies, lanterns, food, water, and my rifle. I arrived Friday afternoon, unloaded my truck, and settled in. The woods were quiet, the air cool, the sun slipping behind the trees. I took a short walk to check the area, saw some fresh tracks in the mud, and felt pretty good about my chances for the weekend. That night, I made a small fire in the wood stove, cooked some simple food, and sat on the porch with a lantern beside me. It was completely dark outside, the kind of dark you only get far away from towns. The stars were sharp and clear. The only sounds were crickets and the occasional rustle in the trees. Saturday morning, I was up before dawn, heading out into the woods. I hiked deep into the trees, found a good spot, and waited. I saw a few deer moving in the distance but didn't get a shot. Still, it felt good to sit there, breathe the cold morning air, and let my mind settle. By late afternoon, I headed back to the cabin, tired but content. I made myself some food, cleaned my rifle, and sat on the porch again as the light faded. That night, the woods were even quieter. And then, just after midnight, I heard it. It was faint at first, drifting through the trees. A scream, not an animal. I've been hunting long enough to know the difference. It sounded like a woman screaming, crying out for help. I froze, sitting there on the bed, listening hard. "Help me!" The voice was far off, maybe deep in the woods. It echoed strangely, like it was bouncing between the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and stepped to the window, looking out. Darkness, trees, nothing else. Another scream, closer this time. Still the same voice, a woman crying out, desperate. I opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold, the woods silent except for the distant voice. I swept the flashlight beam across the yard, down the tree line. Nothing. The screams came again, but now they were moving. First farther away, then closer, as if someone was circling the cabin. I turned slowly, heart pounding, trying to see where they were coming from. But there were no lights, no footsteps, no crashing through the brush. Just the voice, sliding around the edges of the clearing. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. I backed up, went back inside, locked the door and pulled the curtains. I sat down with the rifle across my lap, flashlight on the table. My heart was beating hard, and I kept telling myself, maybe it's someone lost. Maybe it's someone playing a prank. Maybe it's some weird animal sound I've never heard before. But none of those answers felt right. I waited like that for hours. The screams kept coming, sometimes close, sometimes far. I thought about calling for help, but there was no cell service, no landline. I thought about getting in my truck and driving out, but I couldn't bring myself to open that door again. By the time the sun started to rise, the sounds had stopped. I stepped outside cautiously, blinking in the early light. The woods were still, the air damp and cold. I walked the edge of the clearing, flashlight still in hand, rifle slung over my shoulder. There were no tracks, no signs of anyone. After packing up my gear, I drove slowly down the dirt road to the main road. I stopped at a small gas station where locals gathered in the mornings, drinking coffee and swapping stories. I mentioned what I'd heard, careful not to sound too shaken, just curious. The old man behind the counter gave me a long look, then said, "Never go chasing those sounds. Sometimes they ain't people." He didn't explain further, and I didn't press. I just nodded, thanked him, and got back in my truck. I drove home, thinking about that night, about those screams circling the cabin, about the cold, empty woods. Since then, I haven't been back. I don't know if I ever will. It's not that I'm afraid of the woods or of being alone. I've hunted in plenty of remote places, camped under the stars, walked trails where no one else goes. But something about that night stuck with me, not knowing who or what was out there, and knowing that if I'd stepped off that porch, if I'd followed the sounds into the trees, I might not be here telling this story now. I wanted to get away from everything. That's how it started. Work, people, the noise of the city. I was sick of it all. I'd always dreamed of visiting Alaska, and when I saw a winter cabin listing online, I booked it without thinking much. It was a solo cabin, tucked way out past any main roads. The ad said, "Perfect for winter retreat," and I liked the sound of that. It looked small but sturdy, with thick wooden walls, a big stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over endless snow-covered trees. I figured I'd bring books, some food, maybe do some journaling, just breathe for once. The trip there took effort. I had to fly into Anchorage, rent a truck, then drive out for hours on narrow, icy roads. The last part of the road wasn't even really a road, more like a packed snow trail. By the time I got to the cabin, I felt like I'd driven to the edge of the world. I checked the supplies when I arrived. There was plenty of firewood stacked inside and outside. The cabin had a small stove, no electricity, and a battery-powered lantern. The snow outside was deep, probably up to my knees, but I was prepared with boots, warm clothes, and everything I'd need to hunker down for a few days. The first day passed peacefully. I unpacked, got the fire going, made myself some coffee, and sat by the window just watching the snowfall. The quiet was unreal. No cars, no planes overhead, no voices, nothing but the wind now and then. I spent the evening reading by the fire, wrapped in a blanket. That night, I lay in bed listening to the logs crackle in the fireplace. Every now and then the wind picked up, making the trees outside creak. I fell asleep easily, feeling safe and far away from everything. The second day was colder. The sky stayed gray all day, and the snow fell harder. I didn't go far, just walked a little around the clearing near the cabin, then came back inside to warm up. There was no cell service out here, but I liked that. I read, made simple meals, and watched the woods through the window. I didn't see any animals, though I saw plenty of animal tracks in the snow. I figured they were keeping to the trees. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps in the snow. At first, I thought it must be a deer or maybe a moose. I leaned toward the window, listening. The crunching came closer, slow and steady. Then it stopped, right under the window. I froze. My heart started beating faster. I waited, leaning forward a little, but I couldn't see anything. The firelight flickered across the window, but beyond that, it was just darkness. I stayed like that for a few minutes, listening hard. Nothing. Eventually, I told myself it was probably just an animal passing through. Maybe it stopped to sniff around. I went to bed, though it took a while to fall asleep. Every creak and gust of wind outside made me tense up. When I woke the next morning, the cabin was cold, and the fire had died down. I pulled on my boots, jacket, and gloves and stepped outside to get more firewood. That's when I saw them. Boot prints. They circled the cabin. I bent down, staring hard. These weren't animal tracks. They were human boot prints, clear in the fresh snow, going all the way around the cabin's edge. What made my stomach twist was the pattern. There was only one set. No approach, no exit. Just one continuous set of boot prints, going in a circle around the cabin. I walked around slowly, following them. They went past the windows, around the back, and returned to where I'd first seen them. But they didn't lead to the road, or the trees, or anywhere. It was like whoever made them had appeared in the circle and disappeared from the circle, leaving no sign of coming or going. I stood there for a long time, feeling the cold seep into my gloves and jacket. I didn't know what to think. The prints were fresh. They hadn't been covered by new snow. So whoever it was had been there sometime during the night. I went back inside and bolted the door. I sat at the table, staring at the window, listening. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone from another cabin nearby. But deep down, I knew there were no other cabins nearby. I hadn't seen another soul in days. I spent that day inside, barely eating, barely reading. I kept glancing at the window, the door, the edges of the room. The daylight hours passed slowly, the sky darkening again by late afternoon. As night fell, I rebuilt the fire and pulled the chair closer to it. I stayed wrapped in my blanket, listening. I didn't hear anything for hours. Then, sometime after midnight, the crunching footsteps came again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They moved slowly around the cabin. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the blanket. My rifle was propped up against the wall, but I didn't move to get it. I was too afraid to even stand up. The footsteps circled once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. I sat there, heart pounding, until dawn. As soon as the sun was up, I stepped outside again. The air was sharp and cold, the snow blindingly white. The prints were back. Fresh boot prints, circling the cabin again. No approach, no exit. At that point, I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bags, loaded up the truck, and drove out of there without looking back. The drive was long, and the snowy roads were slow, but I made it back to town by nightfall. I checked into a cheap motel and finally let myself breathe. I reported what happened to the cabin owner. They didn't have much to say, just offered a partial refund for cutting my stay short. I don't know who or what was out there in the snow, circling the cabin. Maybe someone living off the grid, maybe someone watching, maybe just a stranger passing through. All I know is I'm not going back. Sometimes at night, when it's quiet, I still hear that slow, steady crunching in the snow. I remind myself I'm safe now, that it's over, but I still wonder, If I'd stayed one more night, what would have happened?